Good evening. It is March 19th, 2018, and I'd like to call to order a special meeting of the City Council. We have a special meeting agenda this evening, and let the record reflect everybody is accountable this evening, all City Council members. So we'll begin now with the Pledge of Allegiance. So looking at the agenda, I want to first, I believe we need to approve it. Is that correct?
I'd move for approval.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and look at the agenda and see public comments. We're going to go ahead and put the public comments after the report that we're having on the update on Healdsburg's economy, context, and balance. So we're going to receive the report and then we're going to invite public comment. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn it over to City Manager.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, council members. So tonight is really the kickoff of really 3 items that council will be looking at during the special meeting here at 5 o'clock, then during our normal council meeting at 6 o'clock. We have Professor Eiler will be giving a presentation here at 5, and then at 6 o'clock we'll be having Mr. Bartel give a presentation regarding PERS, CalPERS, and what the impacts to the city are. And then we'll also have FM3 representatives here giving the results of the community survey, which was just completed. So the intent for these items is to really inform council about what's happening in Healdsburg with regards to our economy, the public's sentiments on certain items, and also give you a perspective on some of the challenges we'll be facing with our PERS obligations. But I thought the best way to start this was to bring Professor Eiler in to kind of kick things off and talk about Healdsburg's economy, put it in context and balance, and he can speak to that. But again, I think the intent of tonight is to really provide a bunch of information to this council. We have goal setting coming up on March 26th, I believe. So this will help inform those decisions. We have our first budget kickoff on April 9th. So again, all this information is leading up to these policy discussions which council will be having in the coming weeks. With that, I would like to hand it off to Mr. Eiler.
There we go. Thank you. So what I'm going to show you tonight is sort of 2 things. One is I'm going to go through some national and state context in terms of where we are as an economy, and then I'm going to talk about a recent report I did for the city of Healdsburg that basically provides a summary of where certain parts of the Healdsburg economy is at currently, at least in the given data we have, and then talk about some opportunities and potential threats that are potentially coming for the Healdsburg economy. So that is our agenda. I'm also going to try to give some ideas about where to go next from my own standpoint, given the scope of the report that I did was relatively limited, but I'll just try to tee up some other things to think about in terms of some information I kind of gleaned as I was moving through the report. So right now at a national level, there's sort of 3 major things economists are watching. The first one is our president, his decision making, what he does on Twitter, and everything else that seems to go on at the White House. I'm actually going to DC this weekend for a Workforce Investment Board conference, but DC is a really wacky place right now in terms of the split, not only politically. If you talk to any politician that works in DC, it's getting more and more fractured, seemingly, at least what I hear from reports, which on the one side, when you think about the way business works in the United States, that can be good because not a whole lot gets done, which means there's not a whole lot of continued regulation that would come up, which would move business forward. But there's also a lot of uncertainty as to what's going to come next, and I'll talk about that in a second. Our equity markets have seemed to bounce back, but we were watching our equity markets pretty closely earlier this year when we saw a lot of, basically volatility take place. A lot of that was around what we thought the tax plan was going to provide and potentially what the Trump White House is going to be able to provide for American business going forward. We will see how 2018 unfolds, but for right now, we seem to have recovered some of the wealth lost, not all of it. The outlook is actually pretty good for the rest of the year, but a lot of it depends on 2 major items. One, what else the Trump White House can get done or what it threatens to do, which I'll get back to as point 3 here in a minute. And second, what happens with the ascension of interest rates in terms of reducing potential real wealth on the stock market. The third is trade. So I used to have the third point here, Bitcoin, until about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and then I traded it for trade once we heard about tariffs starting to rise in the United States. For a place like Healdsburg, all 3 of these issues are not a massive issue yet, but when you think about trade, and you think about the wine that's exported from this area and also the inbound movement of people that come to this area from all over the world, having a trade war is something that economists 2 years ago in the summer were fearing as being the #1 thing that Donald Trump was talking a lot about before the presidential election, that if he was elected would be the one item we hadn't quite accounted for that could lead us to a much more quick recession situation. And a lot of economists have agreed that depending on how wide and deep the tariff changes are, it can easily what you would call truncate the business cycle in a way that would lead to a quicker recession than we first planned. That, coupled with rising interest rates that might be faster than we first expected, if prices rise due to tariffs, the combination of the two could easily take us to recession faster than we expected. So there's some themes coming up here. From the professional endpoint, there's hundreds of economists that all they do is try to predict what's going to happen in the American economy. There is no recession currently predicted. Now, this current set of predictions, and I'm going to give you some shaded areas here to focus your vision a little bit on some of these numbers, were done after the tax deal had passed, but before the tariffs were announced. So if you look at that sort of split, you will see a couple of things. One is that over the next couple of years, the previous forecast from 100 forecasters on Wall Street that all they do professionally is forecast the American economy going forward, increased their forecast in the latest round. Why? Because they expect growth to come from the recent tax legislation. So, for example, in 2018, in quarter four of 2017, the original forecast for this year was 2.5% growth after inflation. Now it's 2.8%, with the supposition that most of that 0.3% increase is due to the tax law passing and giving us as households more after-tax income and also businesses a tax break in terms of tax rates. You'll see that that happens again in 2019, but then that delta fades a little bit in 2020. And why? Is because the American economy has been long predicted, at least in economics terms, about the last 18 to 24 months. As this decade closes, we're getting a little more foggy on how long we can continue in this growth cycle. In the next round, and this is publicly available data from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Branch, it's likely that you're going to see growth rates even sink a little bit more in terms of looking forward to 2020 and 2021, because we'll see more and more effects of tariffs that usually take about 18 months to have their full effect on the American economy when they hit. The next stop is also thinking more just this year. You'll see that there's been an ascension. If you look at the left-hand column, which is the previous forecast, and you look at the right-hand column, which is the new one as of quarter 1, 2018, you'll see that all the quarters going forward this year increased from their original positions 1 quarter ago. But then if you couple that with the annual prediction, economists are not feeling like the new tax law is going to have a long-term positive effect, okay? And then finally, the unemployment rate. We usually talk about unemployment only because we were concerned about how close we are to full employment or how many people are out of work. And usually it's the polar ends when we're slowly descending down from a high unemployment rate to a low one. We're less concerned about where we are in terms of the number, just that fact that we're falling. Now that we've seen the same basic numbers looking forward and also in the American economy on the unemployment rate, we feel like we're getting close to what we think of as full employment. Well, full employment is not only relatively low unemployment rates, it's also how wages ascend and how prices ascend. So when the Federal Reserve is considering interest rate increases, they're thinking about more than just the things on this sheet. They're thinking also about watching prices and watching wages. And if those two variables slowly ascend, it gives us a feeling that there's still people out there in the labor market that are looking for a job, which means that as wages slowly increase, people enter the workforce and stabilize the unemployment rate as wages slowly increase rather than shrink it any further. That's when you really feel like you're at full employment. When wages and prices are rising, you don't see much change in unemployment rates, then you can start saying that we're at full employment. But until all three of those things happen, we don't have a lot to put our hat on in terms of that sort of statement. Speaking of interest rates, this is what I want to show you is happening in the Federal Reserve. These dots represent the Federal Open Market Committee members and what they think is going to happen with interest rates. And these are the folks that actually make the decision for the American economy about the ascension of short-term rates. So the last forecast by this group was that trajectory toward 2020. The new one, which is the dot you see, basically has that median move. So in just the last quarter, we've seen an uptick in what the folks that make short-term interest rate decisions for the United States believe should happen to short-term interest rates as a result of new data in the macroeconomy, specifically the change in the tax law. So if the change in the tax law leads to more spending and maybe more business investment, we should expect prices to rise, and we should expect more pressure on interest rates to rise as a result in an attempt to stave off more rapid inflation. The beauty of it, though, long term, is that we still feel like we're in a good cycle in keeping credit relatively inexpensive into the so-called longer run. But a hand-wavy aspect of looking at data like this is that most economists will tell you that there is no real date for the longer run. We just know it's past the current 3-year span. Okay, so interest rates are likely to come back to some sort of middle ground, even if they ascend above 3% in the longer term. So that's generally speaking good news and predictable. Just real quick on the Tax Act that passed, the so-called Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This is what most economists believe are going to happen between 2019 and 2027, the beginning of the tax benefits with the 2018 tax year, and the ending of the tax benefits with the 2027 calendar year, meaning that in 2026 there'll be most of these legislation will have sunsetted. You can see that in each of the so-called quintiles of the American economy, meaning each one of those 5 buckets, are starting on the left-hand side, the lowest income levels, then the 20 to 40%, 40 to 60%, the 60 to 80%, and then the highest income levels moving left to right. You can see that the higher incomes look like they're going to have more percentage change in after-tax income than lower. And so the rhetoric coming out of the White House is that this is actually going to be a good thing for middle-income households. Most economists disagree with that take. And so when you think about that in terms of what might happen in a place like Healdsburg, which generally speaking is in the 4th and top quintile with the median income in its households, we're likely to see more after-tax income to come to households in places like Healdsburg. So if you see that as a good thing in terms of spending and the support for local businesses, that's great. But most economists see it in a national sense is a speeding up of inflationary pressure when we really don't need the fuel in the tank, and potentially higher interest rates as a result of it, and a truncation of the business cycle. So some longer term things I want to make you think about too a little bit in terms of the latest tax legislation is that it will imply more debt. So for the last 5 years, it's really been a focus for economists the last 5 years on the nature of debt to so-called GDP as a ratio of the solvency of our economy and how much we can actually withstand. Earlier this year, another little bit that helped force more volatility in the equity markets is that the Chinese economy started to talk about slowing down their bond buying binge that's been going on with the American debt. And that started to give Wall Street a little bit of pause in terms of whether or not that was a signal of the world financial markets seeing our tax legislation longer term being problematic in terms of our ability to pay back bonds. The strengthening of the economic cycle we've talked about already, and that solvency issue. And why that might be important is that if you think about how that bleeds down to a state and local level, if you do try to use state or municipal debt when national debt is having potentially some shakiness in the world markets, that will move down the ladder in terms of investors thinking about how solvent then the state and municipal bonds or municipal governments may be in issuing new bonds as they're trying to grow. The next one is more of a state forecast in the UCLA Anderson School, which does a forecast for California alongside of Caltrans, and Caltrans went into a partnership with the so-called California Economic Forecast to look at where jobs are going statewide. Now, this is for the next 10 years. And generally speaking, this looks good on the surface, but there's 2 caveats I want to give you when you look at this. One is what's in the shaded area here. Notice that that project is actually looking for farm jobs to fall. So in California, we actually have a lot of predictions about seeing more food and beverage growth. And with the oncoming of cannabis as a quote-unquote agricultural product, we might see farm jobs or farm incomes rise if you see it through that farming lens. But the supposition is that farming in general is going to become more mechanized and less labor intensive over time due to 2 major items. One is there's been shrinking labor market in terms of being able to share labor amongst multiple agricultural products during harvest time. And the second is potential immigration legislation, which might reduce the labor force and force wages up, which would then usually lead farmers to think about replacing labor with capital, hence a reduction in farm labor. The second one is that each one of those, while growing above, are not growing robustly. So what this prediction tells us is that there is some recession over that 10-year time span. How deep it may be is still an open question, but jobs across the state will only grow somewhere between 0.75 and 0.8% per annum between this year and 10 years from now, at least in the current forecast. When thinking about the North Bay, there's 4 major areas that I tend to watch as an economist. One is just jobs and the breadth of jobs. The North Bay has been, meaning Sonoma, Marin, and Napa counties, has been focused somewhat on more science jobs, or let's think of more STEM jobs, if you will, and has struggled a little bit with that against the Bay Area more completely. Marin County's been a place where bioscience has grown. Sonoma County has slowly seen some evolution in bioscience and in other sciences, but not as robustly as we've seen in past decades. So we're watching jobs very closely. Napa's basically punted completely on diversity in jobs and has become much more of a wine and tourism center every day of the week. And they've actually grown robustly as a result of that. Housing is a big issue. Obviously, the fires, as I'll talk about in a minute, have left a real big problem for Sonoma County, specifically Napa County less so, Lake and Mendocino as well. But we're watching what the county does ultimately in terms of helping mainly Santa Rosa, but also the county in the unincorporated areas that were hurt, grow that housing back up and actually provide a gateway to see more housing units. We'll see. I've been advocating that we actually need to have more housing units than we started with, rather than just assume that we'll end up with less because some people simply won't rebuild. I think we need as many incentives as we can, but we'll see what our policymakers do. How cannabis as a new product actually comes into play. There's a lot of things I've been talking about, and that, yes, it may be positive in terms of job growth and the use of commercial space and other things that we may have seen laying fallow for this recovery period, but we have to watch for petty crime to rise, and some things that have been happening lately, let's say in western Petaluma, for example, a couple weeks ago, really makes it, you scratch your head that people are actually taking those kind of chances, believing that California is now this mecca all over the place of people growing marijuana. We're watching that very closely as economists here regionally and throughout California, because we're really not sure how it's going to evolve and what municipal governments have to do to either take advantage of it or to watch very closely for, let's say, secondary and tertiary problems that may come with it. And the last thing is water. So just about a year ago, California's governor suggested that the drought was over. And then this year, we're concerned very much that the drought will be back again in 12 months. So we will see. But water is something that if you connect all the dots above, if you expect to see housing growth, job growth, and potentially a new agricultural product come on in the right way, water resources will be a factor in that growth. It will be heavily debated as to how fast and how much growth can take place. So let's talk about the fires and their effects real quick as far as more regional context. The Sonoma State University did a very brief survey of the wine industry and tried to get a feel of how much damage there was from the fires and how much, let's say, capital stock was affected. And what we found out is that there's very little capital stock affectation actually from the fires. And I think anecdotally we knew that already going into this. Only about 7% of wineries in Sonoma County were affected. Almost the complete wine crop was recovered, and in a sense, the acreage was unaffected if you think about the vineyards. Now, that's on a stock basis, and economists like to talk about stock versus flow. Stock is what you think of as the capital stock, vineyards, wineries, the wine in the cellar being something to be sold. Biggest problem for the wine industry right now is is it going to go through a PR problem in terms of this year, any taste of smoke in the wine, and whether or not the professional tasters are going to come out and say that the 2017 vintage coming out of either Sonoma County or Napa County specifically has some smoke taint that will then maybe even socially network itself to problems of selling this year's vintage and potentially the next year's vintage. If there's one threat to the wine industry regionally, it's probably that more than anything else from the fires. The second threat is this year's harvest and whether or not there'll be enough labor resources to go around if construction begins in earnest in terms of rebuilding, and cannabis also takes more complete hold on the agricultural side of the economy simultaneous to wine harvests. This is something we actually saw in Napa and Sonoma counties last year, shortage of labor, and that doesn't take into account any potential immigration change. So some of the data that we also looked at was when rebuilding begins, what's that mean? And there's two sides of looking at this story also in terms of the county context. For every $1 billion of potential construction, you get about 5,000 people working, let's say about 5,200 actually more precisely. Then that supports about another 4,000 jobs. So you've got, in a sense, just around 9,100 jobs supported by that reconstruction effort for every $1 billion. Now, the supposition there is that you're going to get about $1 billion of building every 6 months or so. And that labor number is not going to really change that much when you add another $1 billion. Where the action really happens is on the income level. So that $1 billion of rebuilt housing is going to lead to another $536 million worth of income in the broader economy. About 2/5 of that, 536, is actually going to be on support processes in construction, meaning vendors that actually sell things to the construction industry. And then the other 3/5 will be for the broader macroeconomy here in the county. So there's a lot of income to come back to Sonoma County if you think about what was lost. And there's a dubious positive aspect of having a disaster, and then the rebuilding phase brings in an impulse that at some point will end. But if you think about how that affects a place like Healdsburg, there is going to be a labor scramble over the next few years as construction begins in earnest, regardless of how large or the number of billions of dollars that ultimately is reconstructed. Now, one of the other things I did was talk about what would be lost. So one of the biggest debate items is, well, let's say that we don't have a lot of homes reconstructed, and in fact, folks that were in those homes, let's just say in Coffee Park specifically, leave because they don't intend to rebuild and they leave the area. So by using census data, we could kind of estimate the number of people that were working in the affected areas, and if everybody left, the number of jobs that would be basically lost from the county right away, or the number of workers, is about 5,600 people. Now, that's maybe about $750 million worth of spending lost and $53 million worth of taxes that are spread both at state and local areas based on spending, property taxes, et cetera. Bottom line is that a place like Sonoma County will reattract that labor over time. So this is another short-term issue, and this is the worst-case scenario. So you add up all those parts, and while the fires were very tragic, from an economic standpoint, unfortunately, and this is the dismal science aspect of this, when you have tragedy like that, you usually get dubious positive aspects on the other side. Even in the worst case scenario, this will likely all come back because this is an attractive place to live. But is it dependent on something? The answer is sure. Depends on people can live here. So housing prices, if we do not rebuild, will be affected by a lack of rebuilding. If you are trying to own, if you own, you'll get, again, this sort of dubious pleasure bit in having your price, the price of your home, being supported because of a lack of supply. And inflation is, I think I've said it in this room recently too, inflation is 100% a function of excess demand. So if you cut the supply down and force excess demand into markets, you're going to see some price ascension, and we've already seen that, specifically in rental markets. So, and this is just a reminder that we got about a $24 billion economy and about 220,000 people working in this county. So from a contact standpoint, economists believe that there's not going to be a recession, or if one comes, it'll be relatively mild, somewhere between 2020 and 2022. So we don't expect anything before 2020. But we're watching closely because of what we've seen just in the first 3 months of this year has given us a little bit more pause. And we might see some adjustments in the forecast that we first saw as to whether or not we're going to have recession sooner than later. We should expect that the business cycle is going to have some truncation. We've had a lot of fiscal policy suddenly come online where probably we didn't need it per se, except for a re-election cycle. And that kind of thing can easily lead to inflation and interest rate effects that will force us into recession faster than we expected. We should expect shifting labor markets as soon as the construction market comes online. If we believe the same labor conditions existed last year as is coming this year, agricultural harvests are going to be threatened across the board in terms of being able to find labor, which will increase prices and start supply chain effects in terms of costs up the ladder from food. And then finally, shifting labor markets. And there's been a lot of bold claims about how many units are coming. So we've heard our county supervisors talk something of the order of 30,000 units in 3 years. I've heard 26,000 in 2 years. I've heard 60,000 in 10. Folks, we need to put one more in the ground before we get too excited. So how many units, the when and the where, are big questions in terms of not only getting past the fires and their effect on our communities, but also thinking forward about where we're going to see people living, people working, and that dynamic between commuting, employment, and the types of businesses that locate themselves in this county. That's sort of, in a sense, the three-legged stool of economic and workforce development happening all simultaneously. Okay, so with that context, let's now shift over to Healdsburg. 3 key points to make is that Healdsburg, if you look at the data, is not dependent on tourism to support its economy. Tourism is here, like it is throughout Sonoma County, as a part of the economy. And we're going to see some data on this in terms of diversity in just a minute. But the opportunities looking forward, if you think about just the context of what Healdsburg has been doing over the last 5 or 6 years, is probably more in supply chain. So a lot of people get wound up about bringing, Google campuses north and bioscience everywhere and having this, this place where my kids can come back after they get a degree from this place I spent $200,000 sending them to, and then there's no jobs locally, so they end up in Minnesota. Well, part of that is housing. The other part of it is that we have not had amazing expansion of, let's say, scientific or STEM jobs in this county, because the recession has led to calculus that has basically kept most of those businesses in the core Bay Area where the core labor force has decided to land. So in previous growth cycles, we've seen more proliferation out of the Bay Area in terms of tech, biotech, scientific-based jobs. We haven't seen as much of a mass movement in this recovery period, mainly because this recovery period has been very slow in terms of bringing back those jobs in mass. And at the same time, we've seen housing prices rise more quickly, which has slowed the growth and the proliferation of those jobs and businesses out of the core Bay Area. So that kind of leads me to that third bullet, is that we're going to have housing as a regional issue for some time to come. And other things are going to come up, and especially because we have the challenges in the wake of the fires. Let's talk about sales tax diversity and thinking about Healdsburg versus Sonoma County. This pie chart looks like a massive amount of data, but basically there's two things to focus on. One is the sort of 12 o'clock all the way around to 7 o'clock are your classic basic retail sales tax drivers. Everything from auto parts to cars to all kinds of retail you can imagine. It's actually that other outlets, which is the 7 o'clock to 12 o'clock on the left-hand graph in 2010, and a little bit bigger, as we'll see in a minute, in 2016, which is the latest data on this for Healdsburg. 40.1% of the sales tax revenues that come to Healdsburg come from things that are not in classic retail, okay? And that was in 2010. And in 2016, it's even bigger. It's almost 44%. What's that mean? Is you're getting more sales tax diversity in this recovery period than maybe you would expect if you thought that tourism was the driver of what goes on in this community. If you look at Sonoma County, same basic rules apply, except there's a lot more diversity in terms of where sales taxes come in. And the other outlets in 2010 were about 29% of Sonoma County's economy. So classic retail in Sonoma County overall, it generates about 71% of the sales tax, or the taxable sales, and 29% come from other outlets. And that has actually shrunk toward 2016, meaning that retail in all of its possible forms has become more of what drives taxable sales than other outlets, which can be business to business, sales of things outside the retail sphere, meaning, equipment, for example. That has become less of a factor, which means that Sonoma County has become much more dependent in terms of taxable sales and sales tax revenue on classic retail. And if you look at the environs around what supports tourism, those have grown vis-a-vis what's happened in Healdsburg. So it doesn't mean that taxable sales are not growing, because they are, as we'll see in a minute. But what it means is that, at least in this recovery period, as compared to the county overall, Healdsburg has seen a better mix of where taxable sales are coming from than Sonoma County, which has become much more dependent on retail. Jobs-wise, there's still a lot of service jobs in Healdsburg's economy, and this is something we should expect in a place that is basically a place where people live and then they outbound commute and people come in to work to support the local population. You should expect more services than, let's say, goods-producing jobs. This is in Healdsburg for 2016. This is in Sonoma County. So I'm going to try to show you this from a diversity standpoint, that if you look, about 19% of jobs are in something that's either tourism related, restaurant related, or let's just say in general food services and the tourism environs, as well as healthcare and education, about the same size in Healdsburg, where in Sonoma County there's much more education and healthcare than there is, let's say, tourism support. But you should expect that, because Sonoma County is a much broader economy, and it's got more people that it has to take care of healthcare-wise and education as a percentage of the overall economy. Since 2010, in terms of the current job growth, this is basically a roundup of where we've seen. We've seen some reduction in manufacturing jobs, which means that we've seen some reduction in terms of wineries and other types of manufacturing. We've also seen a reduction in retail jobs, which is expected, as we've seen shrinkage of classic retail because of an expansion of internet retail. This is true almost everywhere in California. This is education and healthcare in Healdsburg, and this is the, let's say, the tourism piece where you have quite a jump in the number of jobs in terms of what we've seen recently. Now, if you look at that as a total mix, you can see that the percentage change in the number of jobs has increased for tourism and for education and healthcare, which we saw. They've taken up a much larger piece of the pie. But those jobs on the retail side are usually lower wage, which means the total amount of the economy is not as dependent upon those jobs to move around. Healthcare and education has made up some of that gap. Retail jobs being lost is the other part of the tourism support piece that we don't see in those recreation or, let's say, restaurant and hotel jobs. So when you add those up, the total tourism piece has not grown as much as the far right-hand side looks like, but definitely we've seen some growth, and you should expect that. There's been growth in tourism since the recession happened. You should expect some job growth. This graph, I think, is very important and something to think about. The blue graph is the number of taxable sales per job in Sonoma County since 2002, and you can see the recession, the dip, and then the coming back. But you can see there's been growth in Healdsburg really since late 2000s and on. And the recession was very short-lived in terms of taxable sales per job. And that delta really tells you something about jobs not driving what happens with taxable sales. And this kind of sums up the idea that while there has been job growth, taxable sales have outpaced it. And that taxable sales mix being more on the other outlet side means that you actually you have more taxable sales because the items you're seeing in the other outlets are usually higher priced than, let's just say, things that you would buy $2 or $4 that have taxes on them, or even restaurant meals for that matter, per unit. So you're getting more taxable sales per job. When you're less dependent on retail or in general tourism, you're going to see more taxable sales per job. The beauty of that, you don't need as many jobs to generate the same public finance. Okay? And that's usually a function of job diversity. When your jobs are more skewed towards supporting tourism and retail, you're going to see less of an ascension here. And that's exactly what's happening in Sonoma County outside. So with that data and sort of with that context, what I want to talk about now are some of the opportunities and challenges as I see them. And this is the second part of the report was really kind of more forward-looking. So where the opportunities lie for Healdsburg, in my mind, are in what you call value-added industries. So economic development professionals over the last few years have gotten a lot more stuck on the idea that we need some metrics to think about, okay, where can we be pointed easily by looking at comparative metrics as to where the opportunities are? I'm going to show you a table in a minute that compares two. One is what you call location quotient, which suggests that your area has a relatively easy time in supporting certain types of jobs. And so we should expect jobs to grow there. The problem with that metric is that it assumes you're going to have those jobs for a long time and is really more backward-looking than forward-looking. The other piece I'm going to show you is in value-added, meaning that if you bring a job to your area, how much does it support the local economy when that job comes here versus a broader area, and I compare it to Sonoma County overall. As we'll see in a minute, Healdsburg has some potential opportunities that you may not be thinking about in a classic form, but if you brought those jobs to Healdsburg, you would see more dollars circulating locally from those jobs growing than you would to just keep on the same ones you would do if you just stuck to what's called the location quotients. And I'll try to explain that more in a second. Continuing to look at housing and supporting housing is a big opportunity here in Healdsburg. It's something that should continue, and it's really, as we'll see in a minute, there's some good news and obviously some bad news in terms of where the county context is going, but that Healdsburg has been doing pretty good since the recession, believe it or not, comparatively speaking. Healthcare and tourism are two things I'm going to talk about in the sense that there's still opportunities in tourism, regardless of the dependence or lack thereof. But healthcare, to me, is another place that Healdsburg can find a way of moving forward, as I'll show you in a minute. If you develop more, let's say, specialty healthcare, where there may be a tourism component tied to it, you're going to generate more so-called value add and have more dollars circulating per job than you would otherwise. And that might be a real sweet spot for a place that's a small community like Healdsburg. The other one is trying to bring back manufacturing. We saw earlier that manufacturing jobs have slipped a little bit. Thinking about other parts in the supply chain for manufacturing are things I think are opportunities as well. We'll see in a minute. Some challenges are classics, and we've kind of talked about most of these. We've had a major regional shock that's going to affect housing markets. So even if you keep on plugging in terms of putting more housing in Healdsburg, there's still going to be regional pressure in terms of the overall housing market. There's going to be regional competition. So no matter what you try to bring to Healdsburg in terms of economic development, the region is going to become more and more competitive over time, and you have to be watching that very closely. Thinking about that transition between labor and capital, I went to a conference recently for credit unions in which I had a robot come up with an iPad and say, "Can I help you with the idea that that is the future of customer service representatives in banking, not having students that are 22 years old with a marketing degree take a bank teller job as a pipeline into sales. That is in 5 years going to be very much history. So that transition and how many other jobs are potentially threatened by transitioning from capital or from labor to capital is something that should give you a little bit of pause. And if you're thinking about economic development, the more you can generate income without generating jobs, meaning you get more higher wage jobs that generate more value added for your economy, that's a very good thing to do. Of course, it's highly competitive because everybody wants the same basic outcome. And how we recover from the fires is another piece. So the housing piece was already here. The post-fire recovery and how we plan for it as a county is still a question mark, and hence it's still a challenge. So I alluded to this before. This red line, which looks more magenta, I guess, if you want to put it that way, given where you're at right now. That line is kind of a demarcation line, as most economic development professionals say, look, in that second column, which is called LQ, or the so-called location quotient, anything over 1 is a good thing. Meaning that compared to Sonoma County overall, Healdsburg is a place where jobs in wineries, jobs in vineyards, jobs in equipment leasing, jobs in hotels and restaurants are more supported on average than the random business in Sonoma County. And everything else below that means that compared to Sonoma County, businesses are more likely to locate themselves in Sonoma County otherwise than in Healdsburg. And to a certain extent, it's a way of describing the evolution of the local economy. However, the third column, or what I called here value add Q or value add quotient, does the same comparison, but looks at how does one job and what it provides for the local economy in terms of income compare to Sonoma County overall. And again, anecdotally, you'd say that makes a lot of sense. Wineries and vineyards find themselves here because the economic conditions and the terroir and all the other things that help a winery or a vineyard work, Healdsburg's been a place where that's happened. Equipment leasing, there's a lot of equipment needs, so you'd expect that. Hotel and restaurants, same thing. You do have flow of tourism here. But here's the next two things. If you look at that set of potential industries as maybe targets over time, because these data do evolve each year, other manufacturing, as I alluded to before, where it's like, let's say, light durable, things that would be capsules, corks, bottles, tanks, a lot of the things that would support other manufacturing that's naturally going to happen in, let's say, a 5-mile radius around Healdsburg, having more of that come here and expand that, the value add is greater than 1, meaning that there is probably a reason why it'd be good to focus on those kind of manufacturers to come here. And that's on the durable side, which means normally those wages are higher and the income left behind is larger. And healthcare. So while the jobs in healthcare may be more attractive from an economic development standpoint to stay longer term in Sonoma County, the income they leave is much higher in Healdsburg. So those are some of the reasons why I'm suggesting that there's some potential foci you can look at that would not be, let's say, put forward as a recommendation if you just looked at the jobs piece. If you look at the income piece, which is usually more important to a smaller rural economy, which is located to a larger or next to a larger place, it's a good way of thinking about moving forward. Here's the housing conundrum. So another thing I've been asked a lot of times to look at in a lot of different places is so-called jobs to housing ratio as a way of gauging how the local area has housing units for the number of jobs it has. And you can see that Healdsburg kind of stands out a little bit from the pack, but really is like Sebastopol and the town of Sonoma in terms of having more people working there than there are housing units to support those households. Classic for rural, sort of, let's say, rural to suburban California, where there's a much larger labor market close and a lot larger housing market close. You can see Rohnert Park, for example, has got plenty of housing for the number of jobs in Rohnert Park. Why? Because Rohnert Park has been a place historically where people have lived and outbound commuted to work and brought that money back home to a place where housing has been relatively inexpensive. So you think about housing prices and this jobs housing ratio, they usually walk hand in hand. As the jobs housing ratio ascends, so do housing prices comparatively speaking. But notice the county total has been slowly inching up the bottom line on this graph since the recession and is now close to that sort of demarcation line, meaning that when you have a 1-to-1 ratio, you're starting to get slightly out of balance in terms of jobs and housing. So now the county faces that, and this is just through 2016. Okay? 2017 and 18 are likely to be even more out of balance in Sonoma County overall, mainly because of the fires. Another metric you could look at, which is potentially a challenge or also a way of saying, wow, things have actually been going maybe better than we think, is what you call housing burden. Housing burden is something that the federal government watches as sort of the connection between the median household income and the price of housing. In the top left-hand corner is the so-called housing burden for rental in Healdsburg in 2011. Just try to think about the bottom of the recession was about 2011. And at that time, about 65% of households that were renting in Healdsburg had a median income that they had to pay 30% of or more in housing costs. And maybe my English is a little poor on that, so let me rephrase that. Housing burden is defined by the federal government in a situation where a household spends at least 30% of its household income just on housing costs. So for rental in 2011, 65.7% of renters in Healdsburg were, in a sense, burdened based on their current income level. And owners were about 52% burdened. Now, since then, that burden has actually shrunk to 57% for rental and 33% for owner. Now, you may ask, now, how is that possible when things are rising? Well, remember, this is a ratio, which means if the income level is rising faster than the cost of housing, you're going to see burden shrink. And so Healdsburg has been a place that has attracted a higher income level, even as housing has ascended, and that's why the burden has shrunk. Sorry, so I don't want to get off that too fast. Now, if you think about what can happen or where the opportunity is and what you could see this as, well, that's still a challenge because there's still a lot of burden there, and the answer is you're right. There's still, depending on your lens, there's still some burden here. The more housing units that are put into the economy, the more this burden shrinks. Okay? And Healdsburg should expect itself to be a place where there's still going to be an attractant here for relatively higher income households. Okay? And it's part of the conundrum being a beautiful place and a place where people are drawn to from all over the world to potentially live. It's the burden really of everything that lives above the Golden Gate Bridge. So, in terms of where to go next, I wanted to provide you at least a little bit more detailed level. I think equipment manufacturing, having more data processing, financial services, software companies where it's possible, manufacturing of things like tile, these are the subgroups inside of that same so-called value-added quotient that pop up in the data. So I gave you kind of a high-level look. This is the more focal look inside of those categories. Having more outpatient facilities, doing more beverage manufacturing beyond the wine industry, having tank and pump manufacturing being a supply chain piece to any beverage manufacturing, having more plumbing for the same reasons, and then having more advertising services. Those are the things that really stood out, let's say, at the lower levels of detail in terms of the types of businesses that Healdsburg may want to attract over time, given that value-added piece and not just how many people are working here. So some things the city could do to support this. These are some things I thought that might be good to think about. One is having more broadband investment, making sure that you have as many people, many households and as many businesses exposed to broadband internet as possible. Working with the chamber on incentives for retention and expansion of businesses that are currently here. One of the things you're likely to find, especially if we start to slip closer into recession, is will businesses stick around? So if you like the business diversity you currently have, working sooner than later on what incentives can potentially be provided to businesses that you want to retain or potentially grow, that competition level's rising. Continue with the way you guys are looking at housing. I think it's been a great thing that you have actually made a commitment to put tax revenue toward housing subsidies and keep that up. Watch also for how you can broaden that economic base. That list above is one way of doing that. You already have a pretty good diversity, but don't stop now. It's something that, again, the competitive environment is going to increase. And putting an advisory group together to think about the labor piece. This is something that is, I think, very important in the wake of the fires. I think every community should have an advisory group of businesses that talks to them just about labor needs. This is something, as an economic development person, I've been trying to tell people that you should not divorce economic development from workforce development, and you have to have a communications pipeline open with your local businesses. What do they need? Well, when we get into June, July, and August, you're probably going to have a lot of local businesses concerned about what's going on with labor. Where are we going to find workers? And that might lead to some decisions that you don't want to see happen, meaning that, okay, we'll go through this year, but we might leave next year because we're not going to be able to find the labor we need. And it's not an issue of income. It's an issue of how easy it is to transition from labor to capital in specific types of industries and how hard it's going to be to find labor. So watch for that, and the more you can get businesses' voice on that, the more you can prepare now rather than react, which is always a bad thing to have to react rather than being proactive. So to conclude, as far as I can see in the data, the economy is relatively balanced. There's not a dependence on taxable sales, let's say, from tourism as a way of driving the economy forward from a municipal standpoint, nor looking at the number of jobs that are out there. There's no doubt about the fact, though, that tourism and retail is linked supply chain-wise to wineries, to the beauty of the local economy, to Sonoma County overall is just one part of a larger marketplace. So the sort of push and pull of how much tourism is enough, or where is, sort of the line to be drawn, or how dependent you are, a lot of that stuff is fluid, but the bottom line is the data don't suggest that Healdsburg is out of whack, at least with the county economy, and is actually performing better in terms of being more diverse in the way it generates incomes. The bottom line, folks, is housing is going to remain the biggest issue. So if you're watching the county supervisors, if you're watching state legislators, and you're even going to have your own concerns, housing is going to be the biggest issue probably for the next 2 years, with labor 0.1B right behind it. So with that, that's it, and I want to take any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Sure.
Eiler. Yeah, so we don't have a lot of time, and I want to maximize it. So I think I would want to ask first if there's some brief questions here, and then we can open it to the public, please. So does anyone want to ask any clarifying questions before I open it to public comment? No? Okay, so I believe I'd like to open it to public comment, if that's all right. So if you could be available to answer questions. Sure, appreciate it. Thank you so much. There's a lot going on. So I invite anyone from the public to come forward, and if you have any specific questions to raise, you're welcome to come to the dais. Thank you. Welcome.
Bruce Abramson. I basically just have a question. In housing here, we're trying to look at commercial jobs linkage and commercial fee linkage, and I'd like to get the guests' comments on how that may help for getting more housing and just its implications.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll just take that question. Anyone else from the public like to raise a question or have any kind of comment on this presentation? Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Tim Unger. Great presentation, by the way, very informative. I'd be interested in hearing from the guest speaker what are recommended incentives that the city might undertake to help stimulate housing, and what's been proven to be effective in the past, or what's never been tried that he thinks might prove to be effective now given the current state.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else like to pose a question or make any kind of comment? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close public comment now. Thank you for those two questions, and I believe our speaker will be glad to answer those. So if you need a couple minutes, or are you okay to start?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. So, and I might have to clarify a little bit on the question, but the first question was basically about the nature of jobs and how they interface with housing. One of the beauties of focusing on value add, relatively high value add jobs, is that it assumes that if you're in a relatively high home price area, you will bring in jobs more often than not that can at least afford to live locally. But you should not assume that there's a natural 100% correlation between the income I make, where I work, and where I want to live. Okay, we see people commuting for reasons that are all over the place, and there is not, let's say, one equation that links all the variables between where you locate yourself as a household and where you work, regardless of your income or the type of job you have. I think most of us realize over time that a rising commute level is problematic for our lives, especially once we have kids, once we're married, once we want any kind of lifestyle besides an hour and a half in the car. But there's not an absolute there where you can attract a certain mix of jobs that will necessarily give you a good balance in the worker's ability to live locally.
I believe there's an extension, yes.
I'm familiar with the question that he asked, and so one of the things he was asking was about, we were contemplating a commercial linkage fee. So if a new business wants to come in town, for instance, a hotel, if that business was required to build some sort of affordable housing as part of that building. Do you have any comments on that?
If the supposition is you're going to build so-called workforce housing where you'd have a linkage between the employer and the house, and they provide housing specifically that's so-called affordable for their workers, that's one way. If you just say you're going to provide affordable housing and you're somewhat indifferent as to who works there, you're just going to try to suppress the prices of that housing. Those are two different questions to be asked, by the way. But in general, if you're talking about the provision of affordable housing, you can try that. It doesn't mean that workers will necessarily live there.
So to extend on that before we go to the second question, so is it plausible to create land use codes that specifically address and require that jobs be connected to that? In other words, we are looking for that. So even if it's rentals, but just some way to create workforce housing.
Sure.
So, I mean, have you seen that in other areas? Because we've been exploring that, but it hasn't really been tangibly.
California does not have a lot of examples of this, unfortunately. So you have major employers in the Midwest who have done this because they have 24-hour operations and they want people to live locally, and they actually provide it as a let's say compensation addition, that they're going to give you the housing at a lower price, or perhaps even just give it to you straight up as compensation.
So no examples then.
There's not any great ones that have, let's say, over 5 or 10 year stretch worked well, unless they are 100% tied to the job. It's very tough to control who would ultimately live there and link it to the employer who provided the, let's say, fees to help build it in the first place.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
And then that second question was about recommended incentives to stimulate housing, or anything that proves to be effective, or even things you've seen that are a little out there that we could learn from.
Sure, you can give tax holidays. You can give tax holidays based on a fee like that, where you say, look, if you pay for this housing, we actually provide you with a property tax holiday if they're going to end up owning that piece, or some other sales tax holiday or use tax holiday. You can do a little bit of that. One of the things really nasty about the loss of redevelopment is that you don't have a lot of flexible tools at the local level, right? You're going to come up against a very quick maximum in terms of what you can do locally against what the state basically ultimately controls. So when California punted on redevelopment, it really shifted the matrix in terms of the number of choices you have locally. So you can give a little bit, but there's not an enormous number of choices. No, you can do some, other things you can do is reduce fees, speed permitting, but that assumes that they're going to build and not necessarily take on commercial space that's already ready to go. So as much as you can provide a reduction of cost and a speed to gaining access to the space, that helps a lot.
Are there any other questions? Yes, Councilwoman.
So one of the key takeaways of your presentation was that Healdsburg economy is not, in fact, dependent on tourism. You said that several times. And it seems counterintuitive probably to most people, and you consider all the hotels, the restaurants, the retail businesses that are dependent on visitors and their effect on our sales tax revenues, our transit occupancy tax. And I have to admit, I didn't fully understand why you feel it's not highly significant for Healdsburg. Could you just go over that again for me?
So,
thank you.
Yeah, of course, thank you. So the idea of dependency means that if it goes away, the whole thing falls apart, in my mind, right? Is it a big part of what goes on here? Sure, right? But it's a big part of what goes on in the 70 miles around us as well, right? So the idea that Healdsburg's economy would be gutted as a result of, let's say, a complete removal of tourism is hyperbole. But would it be significantly hurt? Sure. Would it also take a significant shock to the regional area to lead to something like that? Of course. So it would not happen on an island and just say, okay, let's just pop this out of Healdsburg. The regional economy feeds a broader piece of that is not going away. The key is that there's other things happening in the city of Healdsburg that provide slightly more diversity than we're seeing in other parts of Sonoma County. Hence, it's not as important. That's really the bottom line there. So the idea of dependency is a very large statement. Hence, you shouldn't think that it's dependent, because that's a big claim.
Okay. Anyone else want to ask a question? Okay, I have one too, so I'll let you go.
Well, I have so many questions. Right.
Well, so I think just to follow up on that, on Councilwoman Gold's question, the categorization of the all other outlets and other retail in the sales tax diversity. I understand the all other outlets includes like B2B.
Yep.
And that would be like and that's why one of our recommendations was focusing on like the plumbing wholesale kind of right. Okay. What's other retail?
Other retail are things that you don't see otherwise. And I don't remember I can look real quick in the presentation in terms of the outlets that are already stated. So the idea is that basically I didn't want to fill that graph with an enormous amount of things. So if you look at that, you have motor vehicle and parts, you have housing, furnishing, building, food and beverage, gas stations, clothing, general merchandise sales, food and drinking places, or what you can think of as bars and restaurants. The other retail group might be things like miscellaneous types of knick-knack stores, or things that, like, let's say 7-Eleven type of stores that they're going to have some sales taxes that are not, let's say, food. They're not grocery, or they're, let's say, grocery stores that have taxable items inside of them. So that's really where a lot of that other retail comes in.
Because that's a big chunk.
Yeah.
That's a particularly big chunk compared to Sonoma County.
Mm-hmm. You can also, there's also going to be retail sales. For example, if you have internet-based businesses here that are direct to consumer. So if, for example, a winery that's located in Healdsburg sells wine direct to consumer and charges that consumer sales tax, that's going to end up in that other retail group also.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why wouldn't that end up in wine in the? Well, okay. Is there a way that we can get an actual drill down, like a follow up on?
You should have the sales tax data available in terms of the categorizations of this.
There is some elusiveness in that document that I've had since I've been on council. And let me tell you what it is you don't know, you can't track it. I mean, I've had this conversation.
There's a lot of elusiveness in the data, generally speaking, because you can't drill down to the company level due to confidentiality.
So, for example, our wine tasting rooms on the plaza, we don't know if we're actually getting the sales tax when they sell a case of wine in our own town, because they could be routing it back to their original winery. Those kinds of things, I don't understand why we can't drill down on those. I don't know why we don't know what we should know.
I got the same problem, totally.
So I'm just saying, it's to me, and the smoke and the wine, that's perception. Well, perception in this town is huge. People want to live in this town. When they come here as tourists, they come here because they want to see this beautiful little town, and then they look in the real estate window and they see a building that they think they can buy and they go for it. So tourism and real estate go together in this town economically, and that's my claim. So I would argue that there's a lot to be learned from you, and I don't have enough time to ask you the questions I want to ask. We have like 4 minutes. So does anybody else want to ask a question? Because there's so much to learn from you, and I feel like I have more questions. And I want to.
Madam Mayor, if council wishes to go over, that's fine. We can start the council meeting past 6 o'clock.
I didn't know what our guest perspective was on it. Do you have a little bit of time?
Sure.
Okay, because I'm really intrigued by this concept, or the thesis, or the claim that tourism isn't the focus of.
So let me be very clear.
Yeah.
There's a difference between dependency, right, and having a solid balance where that's one part of it. Okay. Napa is much more dependent on tourism than a place like Healdsburg is, because it really 10 years ago, or almost now 12 years ago, put a flag in the ground and said, we're punting on things like Day Pharmaceutical that's got 1,000 workers because we don't care anymore. Because we think we're going to become adult Disneyland, and that's exactly what Napa's become. And the synthesis between what happens on the winery side, the vineyard side, and the food, beverage, hotel, and you name it side of Napa, they have declared as an economic development focus, this is where we're going, right? So where Napa County gets very worried is when the news around the fire says the entire place is on fire. So 25% of the people who suddenly had bookings in hotels say, whoop, we're done now. But for Napa, if that lingers 2 or 3 years in the perception, that's a big problem for Napa. For Healdsburg, it's less of a problem, hence less dependency. Does that make sense? We're all talking about relative terms here, right? So what I was tasked with in the report was to try to show some comparative data that said, look, we get it's a part of the economy, but it's not as imbalanced as you may think it is. And certainly the county itself has had, over this last 6 or 7 years, become slightly more, has taken on more tourism aspects. Part of that's because it's competition against a beast that's growing in Napa County. And Napa County's been driving a lot of what's been going on in Sonoma County the last
Right.
6-7 years.
One thing,
Believe it
though,
or
is
not.
comparison is the greatest thief. I mean, if you want to just, I mean, I understand you got to compare, and that's the numbers, but I just, and, you know, looking at Napa, definitely understand we get compared to Carmel. But my question is just kind of back to the economics is when you look at the opportunities, I do think there's a supposition that you have that your concern is that we may see this as a tourist-based economy. And I don't know if you came into it thinking that, but I felt like when I read your document, and I enjoyed it, and I learned a lot. But one thing I just keep coming up against is how do you compare this town's economics with even Sebastopol when it has a whole different situation going on? I mean, just proximity to Appalachians and the way this town has grown itself around a plaza, and just, I mean, the dynamics of this town, you can't compare it. In my opinion, you can't. Okay. I mean, I know you want to, and I'm not you, but people, they want to, oh, this compares to this. But in the meanwhile, we have this little town of 11,700 people, and we're trying to look at future and what we can do. And I think our citizens are asking us to keep it small in some way, at least the character, whatever that means to people. And so I'm just hungering to know more about how you know what you know. So you have 80% of our employee residents leave each day. How do you get that? Is that the Census Bureau from 2016? So like, I know I drive out to Santa Rosa City Schools 3 days a week. So, so 80% of our employed residents. Is there any way to find out in data how many people live here that occupy homes on full-time basis? Could you find that information out? Like, you know, the second home thing.
Right. In other words, yeah, whether or not you have a primary residence here.
Yeah, we always hear, oh, it's so many people and garbage cans out front. How do you know what you know? I mean, could we ever find that information out?
I don't know if there's any third-party data that would show that. I'm not sure if the census has that deep a drill in terms of knowing who is like, the difference between somebody who's there all the time and somebody who chooses to be there 50.1% of the time, keep a primary residence there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, thank you.
I don't see that happening in the census data if my memory serves correct.
Okay.
But I understand that that's a big concern. I get it.
Perception, like the smoke and the wine, right? You know, it's going to happen. It's just a matter of deciding how you want to interpret it. Councilman.
Rob, I just want to thank you for this is coming out. This is a great report. And I think one thing it does for me at least is give me some assurance that there is diversity in our economy, and I think that you know, there may be a perception that everything that kind of happens in this town is based on some sort of tourism-related thing, and I think that maybe on the face of it, that might be the case when, you know, in the downtown areas, certainly, but you look at all of our industrial areas and things like that, and I mean, it really seems like there's a lot of things that are a little bit less apparent to the casual observer, and so it's really nice to hear that, you know, we don't have all of our eggs in one basket, and that having a diverse economy more so than the county as a whole, I think is a good thing. So, and looking at thanks for bringing up all the comparisons to previous years. I've been looking at these for about 5 years now, so it's always good to see that. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
I'd like to echo that. Thank you very much. This is a very detailed report, and I think from a council perspective, the question is, what do we do with it? Anytime we get one of these reports that we spend a lot of money on, I think it's helpful because it does help differentiate between perception and the data, and it helps. And for me, I look at, it's very encouraging to see kind of where Healdsburg has, kind of the balance that this is kind of showing, that we are a little bit more diverse than what's perceived. And, you know, for me personally, just every day I drive home, I usually go up Grove Street, and I'm driving past a manufacturer of pizza ovens. Next door is somebody that makes pickles and goat cheese, and a leasing rental place. I mean, there's a lot going on there, and I think this is something that I do look forward to in our goal setting. We talked about it this last year about the South Entry Plan. I think something like this, along with some of the other studies that are coming down, is going to give us the data that we need to really look at, okay, how do we, you know, we have a pretty set boundary of what Healdsburg is. How do we round that out? And I think the information in here gives us some targets to look at. I definitely like the idea, and I've said it before, that we heard Councilmember Neokins and I heard in Sacramento, the League of Cities, about economic development focusing on the businesses that are here. If you can help an existing business add one more job, it's almost a better situation than trying to, attract the brand new big, employer to town. So I think there's some discussion that can be had here, and I like having all of this data to reference as a reference point as we go with 5 different viewpoints up here to kind of hash it out to see what's what we feel is the best direction to going forward. So I just want to thank you. Very good report. I've seen your other reports for the county as well.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you for saying that. And again, one thing to keep in mind is I did put some things in the back of the report closer to the conclusions that maybe will give you some talking points in terms of where the data direct, given the current situation and context. You're correct that from an economic development standpoint, that retention and expansion piece is becoming much more of a focal issue than, let's say, attraction. And the recognition you're already sitting on certain businesses, getting them to be larger and keeping them is maybe a little bit more cost effective than trying to go after, the unicorn that's out there that's coming, which I guarantee you go 25 miles south of here and everybody thinks that Google and Amazon are moving northbound, and that's lunacy en masse, right? So, the economic development professional is a lonely hunter in most cases, and this is something that has helped make it a little bit more focus, provide a little more focus, if you will.
Councilman Neokis.
Yeah, I'll just echo my sentiment earlier. There's so much information here to digest. I think I'll definitely have some follow-up questions. I don't want to belabor the point, but I would love to be able to meet individually with you to go over some of these questions. I think
don't hesitate to reach out. Absolutely.
Right. I think a lot of these will really kind of feed into our conversations about budget and our goals as a council. What I think is really interesting is, it's, well, put it this way. I think to me, the takeaway is yes, it's true that that the diversity, we do have a fairly decent, healthy, diverse economy. But I think there are, given the challenges of the overall, the bigger economy and bigger trends of what's going on around us, what actions can we take to enhance the healthy diversity? As just a super simple example, right? You talk about high value, high ad jobs and the challenges facing agriculture and labor, and what we have as a special sauce, right? As a community, I look at that as saying, wow, ag tech, ag automation is right, perfectly targeted for us to emphasize as a goal for
supply chain. Absolutely.
Yeah, right? Yep. So anyway, so that's my takeaway. But I really think that having a deeper conversation before we have those further conversations as a council, I will definitely be reaching out to you for that.
Yep, please do. Appreciate it.
And I just want to thank you for a lot of things, but tonight was good, and I appreciate your work, and definitely appreciate the city manager providing information, and data's interesting, and I just think it's really an important thing for this council to understand the money aspect of the town, so to speak, but also to look at future and what we can do as public policy makers to increase. And I think housing is the one that stays with me the most. It always does. So anyway, and I'm really proud of you. Thank you for all the work you did. And thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, guys. Yeah. Thank you, Mayor. Bye.
Okay, so yeah, I think we should take a short minute break. Yeah, 5-minute break. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and close this meeting of the special meeting will close for 5 minutes and then open for a regular city council meeting.